Eleanor Hathaway, at 83, lay motionless on the opulent four-poster bed in her stately home in Surrey, England. The room, adorned with antique furniture and heavy draperies, reflected a lifetime of wealth and influence. The sharp scent of eucalyptus hung in the air, a testament to the nurses who had fussed over her for days. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on her frail hands. The fall had been dramatic, or so everyone said. Eleanor couldn't quite remember if it was the marble staircase's treachery or the dizziness of fatigue that had done it. Not that she would admit it mattered. As she listened to the muffled sounds of her children downstairs, an idea began to take shape. A dangerous, unconventional idea. Below, the conversation simmered with tension. Her eldest, Sarah, the picture of practicality in her tailored suit, leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly around a porcelain teacup. "We need to be realistic," she whispered sharply. "Mother isn't in her right mind anymore. She's forgetting things. Or choosing to ignore them," countered Daniel, the middle child, adjusting his gold cufflinks. His voice carried the arrogance of a self-made entrepreneur. "We should start managing her estate now, while we still can." Emma, the youngest, sat cross-legged on the armchair, her bohemian dress a stark contrast to the room's stiff formality. "She's not a case study, you know," she said with a wry smile. "Maybe try treating her like a human being for once." Eleanor's hand tightened around the edge of the blanket. Their words stung, but they weren't entirely unexpected. Her children were as predictable as the tides, each bound by ambition, but fractured in their unity. What did surprise her was the brazenness of the conversation, taking place as though she were already a ghost in the walls. "I'll arrange for an official valuation of the estate," Sarah announced, her voice crisp with determination. "It's the only way to avoid disputes later." Eleanor's sharp mind raced. How long had it been since she'd had a real conversation with her children? The dinners, the holidays, the rare family reunions, all painted with smiles but hollowed by unspoken grievances. Somewhere along the line, they had stopped seeing her as their mother and started seeing her as a chess piece. She was tired, but not of the physical pain. It was the exhaustion of being reduced to her assets, her influence, everything but the woman who had built it all. As their voices rose in debate, Eleanor pressed the nurse's call button. Moments later, Claire, her loyal confidant of 15 years, appeared, her face etched with concern. "They're at it again," Eleanor murmured. "Shall I ask them to leave?" Claire offered, her tone measured. "No," Eleanor said, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. "Let them stew. But bring me the blue notebook from my desk. It's time I set a trap." The plan unfolded in Eleanor's mind like a game of chess, one she intended to win. Feigning memory loss wasn't an act of desperation, it was an experiment. She wanted to see who her children truly were when the mask of propriety was stripped away. As Claire handed her the notebook, Eleanor's resolve solidified. "You'll need to help me with this," she said softly, "but you must promise not to interfere, no matter how bad it gets." Claire hesitated but finally nodded. "You know I'll do anything for you, Mrs. Hathaway." Eleanor gazed at her reflection in the ornate mirror opposite the bed. The woman staring back at her was frail, but not broken. She adjusted her lace collar and turned toward the door, just as the argument downstairs reached its crescendo. "I'm not dead yet," she whispered to herself, a glint of determination in her eye. "Let's see how they react when they think I've lost everything, except my secrets." Her finger brushed the call button again, and as Claire left to prepare, Eleanor settled back into the pillows, ready to play her part. Downstairs, the voices continued, oblivious to the drama that had just begun. Eleanor Hathaway's life had been a remarkable ascent from obscurity. Born in 1939 in the small industrial town of Reading, her beginnings were modest. Her father, a machinist at the local factory, and her mother, a seamstress, had scraped together just enough to provide Eleanor and her two younger siblings with the essentials. Yet even as a child, Eleanor had something others seemed to lack, a sharp intellect and an unshakable determination. As the years passed, her ambition only grew. By the time she graduated high school, Eleanor had set her sights on London, convinced it was where she would rise above her station. The city was a whirlwind of opportunity, and Eleanor was quick to seize it. She worked days as a typist and spent her evenings attending business classes. Her sharp wit and fierce determination soon caught the attention of Charles Hathaway, an aspiring financier from a well-to-do family. Their romance blossomed in the early 60s, a time of social change and economic optimism. Charles, captivated by Eleanor's intelligence and drive, saw in her a partner who could help him navigate the treacherous waters of the financial world. They married in 1965, and together they built an empire that would come to define their lives. Hathaway Holdings, their investment firm, became synonymous with success, and the couple's names were fixtures in the social columns, but ambition often came at a cost. As the years rolled on, their three children, Sarah, Daniel, and Emma, grew up in the shadow of their parents' relentless pursuit of wealth and status. While Eleanor loved them fiercely, her devotion to their upbringing often clashed with the demands of her burgeoning empire. Nannies, tutors, and boarding schools became constants in their lives, and Eleanor's presence was an occasional luxury rather than a given. Sarah, the eldest, was the image of her mother, pragmatic, driven, and deeply ambitious. She had inherited Eleanor's sharp mind, but not her warmth, choosing instead to bury herself in her legal career. Daniel, the middle child, embodied the entrepreneurial spirit of his parents, though his methods often bordered on the reckless. Emma, the youngest, stood apart from her siblings. Her free-spirited nature and passion for the arts made her the outlier in a family obsessed with achievement. Eleanor's relationship with Charles, though strong in its early years, began to fracture under the weight of their shared ambition. Arguments became a fixture of their marriage, disputes over finances, business decisions, and most painfully, their children's future. By the time Charles passed away unexpectedly in the early 2000s, their once flourishing partnership had become a distant memory. The rift between Eleanor and her children deepened after Charles's death. Sarah, driven by practicality, grew increasingly frustrated with her mother's reluctance to relinquish control of the family fortune. Daniel, always ambitious, resented what he saw as Eleanor's preference for Sarah's meticulous nature over his daring vision. Emma, meanwhile, felt alienated by her mother's disapproval of her artistic endeavors, which Eleanor dismissed as impractical. These fractures were not born of malice, but of years of misunderstanding and unspoken grievances. Eleanor, for all her brilliance, struggled to express vulnerability. Her love for her children, though immense, was often buried beneath her stern exterior. Similarly, Sarah, Daniel, and Emma had each internalized their own narratives of neglect and favoritism, leaving little room for reconciliation. As Eleanor lay bedridden in her stately Surrey home, these memories weighed heavily on her. The fall had been a catalyst, forcing her to confront not just her physical fragility, but the emotional distance that had grown between her and her children. Listening to their heated debates about her estate, discussions that treated her as though she were already gone, only deepened her resolve. The blue notebook that now rested on her bedside table was more than a journal. It was a lifeline. Eleanor had begun chronicling her thoughts shortly after Charles's death, using its pages to wrestle with the complexities of her life. Its contents were a tapestry of reflections, on her rise to prominence, her failings as a mother, and her hopes for her family's future. But the notebook also held secrets. Fragments of letters never sent, musings on her children's characters, and even a private account of Charles's final days. Eleanor knew these words could either destroy what little trust remained or pave the way for a reckoning long overdue. That evening, as the house fell into an uneasy quiet, Eleanor turned to Claire, her confidant. "Do you think it's too late to fix what's been broken?" she asked, her voice tinged with rare uncertainty. Claire, who had known Eleanor longer than most, hesitated. "It's never too late," she said finally, "but it won't be easy. They'll fight you every step of the way." Eleanor nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then let them fight," she replied, her tone as sharp as ever. "I didn't build my life by shying away from a challenge." As the clock ticked past midnight, Eleanor closed the blue notebook and placed it carefully in the drawer of her nightstand. Her children believed they knew her, an indomitable force, unmoved by sentiment. What they didn't realize was that beneath the steel was a heart still beating, still hoping. For the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to dream, not of wealth or power, but of something far more precious. A family united, if only for a moment. The next morning dawned with a grey mist rolling over the grounds of the Hathaway estate, softening the edges of the sprawling gardens and ivy-covered walls. Eleanor lay in bed, her sharp mind buzzing with the remnants of the heated debate she'd overheard. Her children's voices, tinged with entitlement and suspicion, echoed in her thoughts. It was Emma's comment that had sparked the idea, though it hadn't been meant as a suggestion. "You know, Mom never forgets a slight," Emma had said, her tone light, but her words carrying an edge of resentment. "Not even the smallest thing." That offhand remark had clung to Eleanor like a burr. She had always prided herself on her memory, precise, unwavering, and sharp as a blade. But what if she let it slip, just a little? What would happen if her children thought her memory was failing? Eleanor called Claire into her room just as the clock struck 9. The nurse, dressed in her crisp uniform, entered with a tray of tea and fresh scones, her expression neutral, but her movements betraying a deep familiarity with Eleanor's preferences. She set the tray down and glanced at her employer, noting the intent look on her face. "Claire," Eleanor began, her voice steady but her gaze unwavering, "I need you to help me with something." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Of course, Mrs. Hathaway, what do you need?" "I'm going to feign memory loss," Eleanor said bluntly, watching for the nurse's reaction. The tray rattled slightly as Claire's hand faltered. "Memory loss? But why?" Eleanor cut her off with a wave. "I need to know what they're really after, Claire. It's become painfully clear that my children view me as a means to an end. This act, if you will, is the only way to see past their masks." Claire hesitated, her loyalty warring with her professional ethics. "Mrs. Hathaway, are you certain about this? It could cause damage." "Damage?" Eleanor's laugh was dry. "The damage has already been done, my dear. They've made their calculations, debated my estate as if I were a distant memory. It's time they realize the stakes, and you'll assist me." The nurse sighed, knowing Eleanor well enough to recognize when her mind was set. "What exactly do you want me to do?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "We'll start small. Forget a few names, confuse a few dates. I'll need you to back me up, confirm my condition, sow doubt in their minds. But nothing too obvious. Subtlety is key." Claire nodded reluctantly. "All right. But promise me, if it gets out of hand, I'll manage it," Eleanor said firmly, cutting her off. "I always do." By the time Sarah, Daniel, and Emma arrived that afternoon, Eleanor was ready. The three of them filed into the drawing room where she sat by the window, wrapped in a cashmere shawl. Her posture was less rigid than usual, her expression deliberately distant. Claire hovered nearby, a silent presence who would validate Eleanor's newfound vulnerability. "Mother," Sarah began, her tone clipped. "We've been discussing," Eleanor interrupted, her voice faint. "Who are you again, dear?" The room went silent. Sarah's mouth fell open slightly, her carefully rehearsed speech forgotten. Daniel glanced at Emma, who looked equally taken aback. "It's me, Mother," Sarah said, recovering quickly. "Sarah, your eldest." Eleanor frowned, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Oh, yes, Sarah. Of course. My mind seems to be playing tricks on me lately." Emma's lips parted, but she said nothing, her usual quick wit stifled by the strange atmosphere in the room. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mom, are you feeling all right?" Claire stepped in smoothly. "Your mother's had a few lapses recently. It's not unusual at her age, but I've been keeping an eye on her." Sarah's expression shifted subtly from concern to calculation. "How serious are these lapses?" she asked, her lawyerly instincts taking over. Eleanor feigned a wistful smile. "Oh, nothing too troubling. Just little things. Forgetting names, misplacing important papers." She let the words hang, watching their reactions closely. Emma, always the most transparent of the three, looked genuinely distressed. "Mom, have you seen a doctor? Maybe there's something they can do." Eleanor patted her hand absent-mindedly. "Doctors and their endless tests," she murmured. No, I'll manage." But the seed had been planted. Over the next hour, Eleanor observed as her children tried and failed to mask their unease. Sarah's questions became more pointed, probing the state of Eleanor's finances and the legal authority she still held over the estate. Daniel, less subtle, casually suggested they look into power of attorney just in case. Emma, uncharacteristically subdued, seemed lost in thought, her eyes darting between her mother and her siblings. As the visit drew to a close, Eleanor leaned back in her chair, exhausted but satisfied. The game had begun, and the pieces were moving as she had anticipated. She could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken questions they didn't dare voice yet. And she knew that by the time they did, it might already be too late for them to take control of her carefully laid plans. The news that Eleanor's will might need revision spread quickly among her children like sparks, igniting a dry field. By the following morning, Sarah, Daniel, and Emma had returned to the estate, each carrying their own agendas disguised as concern. The atmosphere in the drawing room was tense, each sibling vying to project an air of authority. Sarah sat at the head of the table, her back straight and her hands clasped in front of her, projecting the confidence of a seasoned lawyer. Daniel leaned casually against the mantelpiece, his posture nonchalant, but his eyes scanning the room with sharp calculation. Emma lingered by the window, arms crossed and gaze distant, as though she could escape the confrontation simply by looking out into the misty garden. Claire entered the room, her calm demeanor masking the growing unease she felt about the situation. "Mrs. Hathaway will join you shortly," she said. Her words hung in the air as the siblings exchanged wary glances. "I still think we need to act quickly," Sarah began, breaking the silence. "If Mother's condition is worsening, it's our responsibility to ensure her affairs are in order." "Define our responsibility," Daniel retorted, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You mean your responsibility to take control of everything, don't you?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "That's not fair, Daniel. I'm talking about practical steps. Someone needs to make sure her assets are managed properly." Emma turned from the window, her voice softer but no less pointed. "Managed properly or divided up conveniently? She's not even gone, Sarah. Don't you think this is all a bit premature?" "I'm trying to avoid a mess later," Sarah replied, her voice rising. "If you'd bother to think beyond your sentimental fantasies, you'd see I'm trying to protect all of us." Daniel laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Protect us, or protect your share? Let's not pretend this is altruism." Eleanor, sitting just beyond the door, listened to the exchange with a pang of disappointment. She adjusted the blanket on her lap, her face a mask of calm despite the turmoil stirring within her. This was precisely the scenario she had anticipated, yet hearing it unfold was no less painful. Claire returned to her side, a shadow of concern crossing her face. "Are you sure you want to go in now, Mrs. Hathaway?" Eleanor nodded, her resolve firm. "Yes, Claire." "It's time." The nurse helped her into the room, Eleanor's frailty on full display as she leaned heavily on her cane. The siblings fell silent as she entered, their arguments dissipating under the weight of her presence. Sarah moved to pull out a chair for her mother, but Eleanor waved her off, lowering herself slowly into the seat with Claire's assistance. "Good morning," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but commanding. She let the silence stretch for a moment, her eyes sweeping over her children. "I hear there's been quite a bit of discussion about my condition." Sarah cleared her throat, attempting to regain her composure. "Mother, we're just concerned. With everything happening, we thought it might be wise to..." "To what?" Eleanor interrupted, her tone sharp enough to cut. "To dissect my life while I'm still breathing." Emma flinched at the words, her discomfort visible. Daniel avoided his mother's gaze, while Sarah met Eleanor's eyes with an expression that teetered between guilt and defiance. "We're only trying to help," Sarah said finally, her voice quieter now. "Help yourselves, perhaps," Eleanor said dryly. She glanced at Claire, who nodded subtly before leaving the room to give the family privacy. Eleanor took a breath, allowing her voice to soften just enough. "I understand your concerns truly, but let me remind you that I'm still capable of making my own decisions. However," she let the word linger, watching their reactions carefully. "Claire has mentioned that my will might need revisiting, considering certain circumstances." Daniel straightened, his casual posture evaporating. "What kind of circumstances?" Eleanor smiled faintly, a gesture that held no warmth. "That's something I'll decide, Daniel. But rest assured, I intend to leave everything in order." The tension in the room thickened as her words sank in. Sarah leaned forward, her tone cautiously measured. "Mother, if there's anything we can do to support you..." "You can start," Eleanor said, cutting her off, "by not treating me as though I'm already 6 feet under." Emma's face flushed with embarrassment, and even Daniel seemed momentarily chastened. Sarah, however, recovered quickly. "Of course, Mother. We only want what's best for you." Eleanor tilted her head, her gaze piercing. "Do you, I wonder?" The words hung heavy in the air, unspoken accusations echoing louder than anything that had been said. Eleanor let the silence stretch, watching as her children shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "That will be all for now," she said. "Claire will update you if there are any changes." As they filed out of the room, Eleanor felt a twinge of exhaustion, but it was tempered by a sense of grim satisfaction. They had shown their hands just as she knew they would. Now, the real test would begin. Later that evening, Eleanor sat in her private study, the blue notebook open in front of her. The soft glow of the desk lamp highlighted her lined face, making her look every bit the aging matriarch she had become. Yet her eyes remained sharp, betraying none of the frailty she had projected earlier. The events of the day had unfolded as she'd anticipated, but there was something unsettling about the depth of tension among her children. It gnawed at her thoughts as she turned the pages of her notebook. Her study had always been her sanctuary, a place filled with reminders of the life she had built. Framed photographs of her and Charles at charity galas lined the walls, alongside pictures of her children during happier times. Yet, among these were gaps, missing moments where distance, both emotional and physical, had replaced togetherness. Claire entered quietly, carrying a tray with Eleanor's evening tea. "Shall I draw the curtains, Mrs. Hathaway?" she asked, her voice soft. "No, leave them open," Eleanor replied, glancing at the darkened garden beyond the window. "The night feels alive. It helps me think." Claire hesitated by the desk, clearly troubled. "Is there something on your mind, Claire?" Eleanor asked without looking up. The nurse set the tray down carefully. "I overheard Sarah speaking to your solicitor this afternoon. She was asking about one of your accounts, the one tied to the London property." Eleanor's pen paused mid-word. "Did she now?" Claire nodded, her expression taut. "I thought you should know." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her lips tightening into a thin line. Sarah's meticulous nature had always been both an asset and a flaw. She was the child who could catalogue every detail, but often missed the larger picture. Yet this overstep felt more deliberate, more personal. "Thank you, Claire," Eleanor said finally. "You've done well to tell me." As Claire left the room, Eleanor closed the notebook and stared at the framed photograph of Sarah on her wedding day. It was a portrait of a different time, when Sarah's focus had been on her new life rather than on control. Eleanor's chest tightened with the memory. She reached for the phone on her desk and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. The voice on the other end answered quickly. "Hathaway Holdings, this is Duncan." "Duncan, it's Eleanor," she said, her voice measured. "I need to ask about the London account, specifically its recent activity." There was a pause, then the familiar sound of papers rustling. "One moment, Mrs. Hathaway," Duncan said. When he spoke again, his tone was cautious. "It appears there was a withdrawal last week, a significant one." "How significant?" Eleanor asked, though her stomach churned with the answer she already suspected. £500,000, Duncan replied, "authorized by Sarah Hathaway." Eleanor exhaled slowly, gripping the phone tighter. "I see. Thank you, Duncan. That will be all for now." She replaced the receiver and sat motionless for a long moment, staring at the phone as if it might provide further answers. Sarah's actions were not just a breach of trust. They were a declaration of war. The children were testing the boundaries of her authority, probing for weakness. Eleanor had never been one to shy away from conflict, but this betrayal was deeply personal. The sound of voices from the hallway interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor rose slowly, her cane tapping against the polished wood floors as she made her way toward the door. She cracked it open just enough to hear Sarah and Daniel's hushed conversation. "We can't wait any longer," Sarah was saying. "If Mother's health really is deteriorating, we need to take control before it's too late." "And how do you suggest we do that?" Daniel replied, his tone skeptical. "You're the one with the legal expertise." "I've already started the process," Sarah said. "Once we have power of attorney, we can consolidate the accounts and protect the assets." "Protect them from what?" Emma's voice cut in suddenly, sharper than usual. Eleanor hadn't realized she was there. "From Mom, you talk about her like she's a liability." "She's vulnerable, Emma," Sarah said, her tone softening but not losing its edge. "I'm doing this for her and for us." "Funny," Emma replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "It sounds more like you're doing it for yourself." Eleanor closed the door silently, her heart pounding. The dynamic among her children was shifting, becoming more volatile with each passing day. They were fracturing further, and she was the catalyst. As she returned to her desk, Eleanor considered the weight of the path she had chosen. Manipulating her children had never been her desire, but it had become her necessity. Yet tonight's revelations deepened the complexity of her plan. Sarah's calculated betrayal, Daniel's ambivalence, Emma's defiance. It was all converging into a storm she might not be able to control. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt a pang of doubt. She poured herself a cup of tea and stared out into the night, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. The woman staring back at her looked formidable, but Eleanor knew the truth. Beneath the armor of wealth and authority, she was simply a mother trying to protect what remained of her family, even if it meant destroying the illusions they had built around her. The morning sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of Eleanor's bedroom, casting intricate patterns on the worn rug beneath her feet. She sat propped against the pillows, her face a mask of calm, though her mind churned with the events of the previous evening. Claire entered quietly, placing a tray of breakfast on the bedside table. "They're still here," Claire said, her tone carefully neutral. Eleanor arched an eyebrow, sipping her tea. "All three of them?" Claire nodded. "They're in the dining room. It seems they're planning to stay a while." Eleanor smiled faintly, her sharp gaze betraying no surprise. "Good. Let them stew." Claire hesitated before speaking again. "Mrs. Hathaway, are you certain about this? The tension between them, it's only growing." "Precisely," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. "They need to reveal their true colors, Claire. This charade is the only way I'll ever know who they really are." The nurse frowned, but she knew better than to argue. Over the years, she had come to understand Eleanor's unyielding resolve. With a reluctant nod, Claire left the room, her footsteps fading into the corridor. Meanwhile, in the dining room, the air was thick with unspoken grievances. Sarah sat at the head of the table, meticulously buttering a piece of toast, as though the action might bring her control over the day's events. Daniel leaned back in his chair, scrolling absent-mindedly through his phone, while Emma sipped her coffee, her gaze distant. "Mother's not going to live forever," Sarah said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was clinical, but there was an edge of impatience beneath the veneer. Daniel glanced up, his brow furrowed. "You have an exceptional way of stating the obvious, Sarah." Emma set her cup down with a clink, her expression tightening. "Does it ever occur to you that this is about more than her estate? She's still alive, Sarah. She can hear, think, and feel, you know." Sarah sighed, setting her knife down with deliberate precision. "Of course, it's about more than that, but someone has to be practical. Do you want her to be taken advantage of? Or worse, end up destitute because we ignored the signs?" Daniel scoffed. "Destitute? She's Eleanor Hathaway. The woman has more money than most small countries." Emma's lips pressed into a thin line. "And yet, here we are, picking apart her life as though she's not upstairs right now." The tension crackled between them like static electricity. None of them noticed Eleanor's silent approach until she stood in the doorway, her cane tapping softly against the polished floor. "Good morning," she said, her voice mild but carrying enough authority to silence them. "Mother," Sarah said, rising quickly to pull out a chair for her, "we were just discussing—" "I heard," Eleanor interrupted, settling herself at the table with Claire's help. "And it's heartwarming to know how deeply you all care about my future." Her words hung in the air, their double-edged meaning unmistakable. Sarah flushed slightly, while Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Emma, however, met her mother's gaze directly, her expression unreadable. "I do have something to say," Eleanor continued, her voice calm but firm. "I've been thinking about my legacy, what it means and what it should mean." The siblings leaned in slightly, their attention sharpening. "For years, I've built this family's wealth, its reputation. I've ensured that you've had every advantage, every opportunity to succeed. But what I see before me now—" She paused, letting her gaze sweep over them. "What I see now troubles me. Mother, we're just trying to—" Sarah began, but Eleanor held up a hand to silence her. "I'm not finished," she said. "You speak of protecting me, of managing my affairs, but in doing so, you reveal your own concerns, your own fears, and perhaps your own motives." Daniel frowned. "Are you suggesting we're being selfish?" Eleanor arched an eyebrow. "Aren't you?" Emma, who had been silent throughout, finally spoke. "So, what happens now? Are we supposed to prove ourselves worthy of your approval, of your money?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "Perhaps. Or perhaps I've already made my decision." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on them. Each sibling grappled with the implications, their minds racing with possibilities. Before any of them could respond, Eleanor stood, her movements deliberate and measured. "Claire will let you know if I need anything," she said, her tone dismissive. "You may continue your discussions." As she left the room, the siblings exchanged uneasy glances. Whatever Eleanor's intentions, they were clearly not as simple or as predictable as any of them had assumed. Upstairs, Eleanor returned to her study, her expression contemplative. Claire followed her, closing the door behind them. "They didn't take it well," Claire observed. "Good," Eleanor replied, her voice low. "Let them wrestle with their own consciences. If they have any left." She picked up her blue notebook, the pages filled with careful observations and strategies. The game was far from over, and Eleanor knew that the next moves would determine everything. The late afternoon sunlight streamed into the Hathaway Estate's drawing room, casting long shadows over the ornate furniture. The warmth of the light seemed at odds with the growing unease that had settled among Eleanor's children. After their tense breakfast, each had retreated to different corners of the house, but the undercurrent of suspicion and conflict lingered. Sarah had claimed a corner of the library, her laptop open as she pored over legal documents. Her movements were precise, but there was an edge to them, a quick tapping of her pen, a slight tightening of her lips. She was trying to stay ahead, to anticipate whatever Eleanor might have planned. She didn't notice Emma walk in until her sister dropped a book onto the desk with a thud. "Still strategizing, I see," Emma said, folding her arms. Her voice held a lightness that didn't quite mask the accusation underneath. Sarah didn't look up. "Someone has to..." Emma sighed, pulling a chair closer. "You act like this is some hostile takeover. She's our mother, Sarah, not a business acquisition." "Is she?" Sarah retorted, finally meeting Emma's gaze. "Because right now, it feels like she's testing us, playing a game we don't even know the rules to." Emma frowned, her fingers tracing the edge of the desk. "Maybe because you keep treating her like an asset instead of a person." Before Sarah could respond, Daniel appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. "What's this? Another round of sibling bonding?" Emma shot him a glare. "We were talking about Mom. You know, the woman upstairs who's probably overhearing every word we say." Daniel smirked. "Let her. Maybe then she'll realize how ridiculous this whole thing is." Sarah stood abruptly, snapping her laptop shut. "If you two are just here to antagonize me, don't bother. I have real work to do." Daniel stepped into the room, his tone turning serious. "This isn't just about you, Sarah. Whatever Mom decides affects all of us. You might want to remember that." The tension between the three was palpable, a volatile mix of past grievances and present mistrust. But before any of them could escalate the argument further, the sound of a car pulling up the driveway drew their attention. Emma moved to the window, her brow furrowing as she peered out. "Who's that?" she asked. Sarah joined her, her expression darkening. "That's Margaret." "Margaret?" Daniel repeated, his tone skeptical. "The cousin?" Sarah nodded, her jaw tightening. "And no doubt here to help." Emma turned to face her siblings, confusion etched on her face. "I don't understand. Why would Margaret be here?" Sarah crossed her arms, her voice heavy with disdain. Because she sees an opportunity, just like everyone else. By the time Margaret entered the drawing room, escorted by Claire, the siblings had settled into an uneasy silence. Margaret, a woman in her late 40s with an air of self-assured charm, greeted them warmly, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sarah, Daniel, Emma," she said, her tone smooth. "It's been far too long." "What brings you here, Margaret?" Sarah asked, her voice clipped. Margaret's smile widened, but there was a calculating glint in her eye. "Family, of course. I heard about Aunt Eleanor's condition and thought it best to visit." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "How thoughtful of you." Margaret ignored his sarcasm, taking a seat near the fireplace. "I only want to ensure she's being cared for properly, and to offer my support should she need it." Emma, ever the skeptic, leaned forward. "Support? Or are you hoping to be written into the will?" Margaret's expression didn't falter, though her smile thinned slightly. "Is that how you see me, Emma? A fortune seeker?" Sarah cut in before the conversation could spiral further. "Let's not waste time pretending, Margaret. We all know why you're here." Margaret's gaze hardened, though she kept her composure. "And why are you here, Sarah? Out of the goodness of your heart?" The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of unspoken truths hanging heavy in the air. Claire, who had been standing quietly by the door, cleared her throat. "Mrs. Hathaway would like to see all of you in the drawing room," she said, her voice steady but firm. The siblings and Margaret exchanged wary glances before following Claire down the hall. When they entered, Eleanor was already seated, her posture regal despite her apparent frailty. She looked at each of them in turn, her expression unreadable. "Margaret," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It's been a long time." Margaret stepped forward, her tone warm. "Aunt Eleanor, you're looking well." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Flattery doesn't suit you, Margaret, but I appreciate the gesture." The room grew quiet as Eleanor's gaze swept over her children. "It seems my condition has brought out the best in all of you." The sarcasm in her tone was impossible to miss, and the siblings shifted uncomfortably. Margaret, however, held her ground, her smile unwavering. "I came to help, Aunt Eleanor," Margaret said, her voice steady. Eleanor's smile faded slightly. "We'll see about that." The tension in the room was palpable, a fragile balance that threatened to shatter with the slightest provocation. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes taking in the faces around her. "Let's see what happens next," she said softly, her words carrying the weight of a challenge. The arrival of Richard G., Sarah's teenage son, brought a rare moment of warmth into the tense Hathaway estate. At 17, Richard carried an air of quiet sincerity that set him apart from the competitive dynamic among his mother, uncle, and aunt. He arrived late in the afternoon, his battered duffel bag slung over one shoulder, his posture awkward but confident. His presence was both unexpected and disarming, a stark contrast to the calculated moves of the other family members. Eleanor was in her study when Claire informed her of Richard's arrival. "He said he wanted to see you," Claire added, a soft smile breaking her usual professional demeanor. "He seems genuine, Mrs. Hathaway." "Does he?" Eleanor murmured, though a hint of curiosity flickered in her expression. "Send him in." Moments later, Richard entered the study, his presence filling the space in a way that was neither imposing nor meek. He wore a plain sweater and jeans, his dark hair slightly tousled, as though he had rushed to get there. "Grandmother," he said, his voice steady but gentle, "I hope I'm not intruding." Eleanor gestured to the chair opposite her, her sharp eyes appraising him. "Intrusion is a relative term in this house," she replied, her tone neutral. "What brings you here, Richard?" He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I wanted to see how you're doing. Mom mentioned... well, she mentioned you weren't feeling great." Eleanor tilted her head, her gaze narrowing slightly. "And you came to check on me out of concern?" "Yes," he said simply, meeting her gaze with an earnestness that surprised her. For a moment, Eleanor was silent, studying him. Richard's sincerity was disarming, and she found herself softening despite her initial skepticism. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose I should be grateful someone in this family is interested in my well-being." Richard smiled faintly, the corners of his eyes crinkling in a way that reminded her of Sarah when she was his age, before ambition had hardened her features. "I'm not sure what's going on with everyone else," he admitted, "but I figured you could use some company." Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. "You might be the first person to come here without an agenda, Richard. That's a rare thing these days." They spoke for nearly an hour, their conversation weaving between Richard's plans for university and Eleanor's memories of her own youth. His genuine curiosity and lack of pretense were a balm to her, a reminder of the simplicity that once existed in her family before wealth and ambition complicated everything. By the time he left the study, Eleanor felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Downstairs, Richard's presence did not go unnoticed. Sarah, pacing the length of the library, noticed him in the hallway and called out, "Richard!" "What are you doing here?" Richard paused, adjusting the strap of his bag. "I came to see Grandma," he said, his tone even. Sarah frowned, her sharp gaze sweeping over him. "You should have told me you were coming. This isn't exactly a good time." "I didn't think I needed an appointment to visit my own grandmother," Richard replied, his voice calm but firm. Sarah sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "It's not about that. There's a lot happening right now." "You don't understand." "Maybe I don't," Richard said, his gaze steady, "but I think Grandma deserves better than whatever it is you're all doing." The words stung, and for a moment, Sarah looked as though she might argue, but Richard's quiet conviction held her back. Instead, she turned away, muttering something about needing to make a call. Richard continued down the hall, his presence an unsettling force in the fragile balance of the household. Emma caught up with him near the garden, her expression a mix of curiosity and relief. "Richard," she said, falling into step beside him, "it's good to see you. How's school?" "It's fine," he replied, glancing at her. "Better than whatever's happening here." Emma laughed softly, though there was little humor in it. "You've always been perceptive. Too perceptive, maybe." He shrugged, his hands in his pockets. "I don't need to be perceptive to see that everyone's at each other's throats." Emma sighed, her gaze drifting to the manicured hedges beyond the window. "It's complicated, Richard. Families are always complicated." "That's no excuse," Richard said quietly, his voice carrying a weight beyond his years. "Grandma deserves better." Emma looked at him, her expression softening. "You're right," she said after a moment. "She does." As the day wore on, Richard's presence began to ripple through the household. His quiet compassion stood in stark contrast to the calculated moves of the others, and it did not go unnoticed by Eleanor. Watching him from her window as he wandered the garden, she felt a rare sense of pride and a growing determination. For all the fractures in her family, perhaps there was still something worth salvaging. The Hathaway estate had settled into an uneasy quiet by evening, though tension lingered like the oppressive humidity before a storm. Eleanor, watching the sky darken through her window, found herself reflecting on the dynamics playing out in her home. Her plan was bearing fruit, but the resulting fractures among her children weighed on her more heavily than she had anticipated. Still, she reminded herself, it was necessary. Only by stripping away pretense could she truly see their hearts. Claire entered the room, carrying Eleanor's evening tea. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent years anticipating her employer's needs. Yet there was a hesitancy in her steps tonight. "You look like you have something on your mind," Eleanor said without turning from the window. Claire hesitated before speaking. "Emma came to see me earlier. She asked if I thought you'd consider letting her stay here to help care for you." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, finally glancing at Claire. "And what did you say?" "I told her that was something only you could decide," Claire replied carefully. She seemed genuine. Eleanor's expression softened slightly, though her skepticism remained. Genuine in her concern or in her guilt? "I couldn't say," Claire admitted. "But she seemed earnest." Eleanor nodded, dismissing Claire with a wave. As the door clicked shut behind her nurse, Eleanor's thoughts turned to Emma. Of all her children, Emma had always been the most enigmatic. Her artistic temperament set her apart, and her refusal to conform to the family's expectations had been a constant source of tension. Yet, it was precisely Emma's unpredictability that now gave Eleanor pause. Perhaps there was more to her than the flighty dreamer her siblings often dismissed. Later that night, Eleanor decided to summon Emma for a private conversation. When Emma entered the study, she looked more composed than Eleanor had expected, though there was a nervous energy about her. "You wanted to see me, Mom?" Emma asked, her voice tentative. Eleanor gestured for her to sit, studying her youngest daughter carefully. "Claire tells me you're thinking of staying here to care for me." Emma flushed slightly, but met her mother's gaze. "I just thought, with everything going on, maybe I could help. You shouldn't have to go through this alone." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in thought. "And why now, Emma? After all these years of keeping your distance, what makes you think I need you?" Emma flinched at the bluntness of the question but didn't back down. "Maybe I've been selfish," she admitted. "Maybe I stayed away because it was easier than facing how much we've drifted apart. But I'm here now, and I want to help. Isn't that enough?" Eleanor's expression softened, though she kept her tone measured. "It's a start. But let me be clear, Emma, helping me isn't just about staying in this house. It's about understanding what I need, not what you think I need. Can you do that?" Emma nodded, her jaw set with determination. "I can." As the conversation drew to a close, Eleanor felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected. Hope. Emma's sincerity seemed genuine, though Eleanor knew better than to trust appearances fully. Still, it was a step in the right direction, and that was more than she had dared to hope for. Downstairs, however, the tension between Daniel and Emma was reaching a boiling point. Daniel, ever the opportunist, had cornered Emma in the library after overhearing part of her conversation with Claire earlier. "So, you're moving in now?" Daniel said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Decided to play the dutiful daughter, have you?" Emma glared at him, her patience wearing thin. "I don't have to justify myself to you, Daniel." He smirked, leaning against the doorframe. "Of course not, but don't think for a second that I don't see what you're doing. You think this will get you closer to her, closer to the inheritance." Emma's eyes flashed with anger. "Is that what you think this is about? Money? Unlike you, I actually care about her." Daniel's smirk vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "Don't pretend you're any better than the rest of us. We all have our angles, Emma." "At least I'm honest about mine." The argument escalated, their voices rising until Sarah appeared, her face a mask of frustration. "Would you two keep it down?" she snapped. "Do you want her to hear you?" Emma turned on Sarah, her voice shaking with fury. Maybe she should. Maybe then she'd see how disgusting all of this has become. Eleanor, sitting alone in her study, couldn't make out the words of their argument, but the sound of their voices carried through the walls, sharp and bitter. She sighed, closing the blue notebook she had been writing in. The weight of her children's conflict pressed heavily on her, and for the first time in years, she questioned whether her plan might be doing more harm than good. As the house fell silent once more, Eleanor resolved to watch her children even more closely in the coming days. The game was far from over, and every move they made would bring her closer to the truth. The following morning, the atmosphere in the Hathaway estate was thick with unresolved tension. Eleanor, seated at the head of the dining table, sipped her tea with deliberate calm, her presence casting a shadow over the strained silence between her children. Claire stood nearby, her practiced neutrality masking her unease as she moved around the room, ensuring Eleanor's comfort. The table was unusually full. Sarah, with her impeccable posture, meticulously rearranged the papers she had brought down from the study. Daniel scrolled through his phone, occasionally throwing glances at Emma, who sat across from him, resolutely ignoring both her siblings. Richard had joined them, his presence an awkward but earnest attempt to bridge the widening rift. Eleanor set her teacup down, the soft clink breaking the silence. "I see we've reached a new level of quiet hostility," she said, her tone dry. Sarah looked up, her expression carefully measured. "We're just thinking, Mother. Thinking." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "How novel." "About what, I wonder?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, but before anyone could respond, Richard cleared his throat. "Actually, Grandma, I was thinking it might be nice to spend some time with you today. Just the two of us." Eleanor's expression softened for the briefest moment. "How thoughtful of you, Richard. I think I'd like that." The younger Hathaway siblings exchanged glances, their discomfort palpable. Daniel, never one to shy away from speaking his mind, leaned forward. "That's all well and good, but shouldn't we be addressing more pressing matters?" "Pressing matters," Eleanor repeated, her gaze sharp. "Do enlighten me, Daniel." Daniel hesitated, momentarily thrown off balance by Eleanor's directness. "I just mean, with everything going on, it might be time to start making some decisions about the estate. For everyone's sake." "Ah, yes," Eleanor said, leaning back in her chair. "The estate. It always comes back to the estate, doesn't it?" Emma, who had been quietly observing the exchange, suddenly spoke. "Maybe it doesn't have to. Maybe we could focus on something else for a change, like actually being a family," Daniel scoffed. "That's rich coming from you, Emma. You're the one who's been absent for years, and you've been here scheming and manipulating," Emma shot back. "Don't pretend you're any better." "Enough," Eleanor said sharply, her voice cutting through the argument like a blade. "If you're going to bicker like children, at least have the decency to do it out of my sight." The table fell silent, the weight of Eleanor's disapproval pressing down on them. She rose slowly, her cane tapping against the floor as she moved toward the doorway. "Come, Richard," she said over her shoulder. "Let's leave them to their thinking." As Eleanor and Richard left the room, Sarah exhaled deeply, her composure cracking ever so slightly. "This is getting out of hand," she muttered. Daniel shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "Speak for yourself." "I think it's just getting interesting." Emma pushed her chair back abruptly, the scrape of wood against tile punctuating her frustration. "You're both impossible." She left the room without another word, leaving Sarah and Daniel to their quiet, simmering tension. In the garden, Eleanor and Richard strolled along the stone path, the crisp morning air carrying the faint scent of blooming lavender. For the first time in days, Eleanor felt a sense of peace, however fleeting. Richard walked beside her, his pace matching hers, his quiet presence a welcome contrast to the chaos indoors. "You don't have to answer this, Grandma," Richard began hesitantly. "But why do you think they're all so—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Angry?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "Anger, my dear. often masks fear. They're not angry at me, not really. They're angry at what they might lose, what they think they deserve. Richard frowned. But it's not just about the money, is it? Eleanor smiled faintly. Not entirely, no. But money has a way of distorting things. Relationships, priorities, even love. I've seen it time and time again. They reached a bench overlooking the garden pond, and Eleanor gestured for Richard to sit beside her. She studied his face, so young yet so perceptive, and felt a pang of regret for the bitterness that had consumed her family. "You're different, Richard," she said softly. "You see the cracks in this family, and yet you're not trying to exploit them. That's rare." Richard looked down, his cheeks reddening slightly. "I just want things to be better for everyone." Eleanor placed a hand on his, her grip surprisingly firm. "Sometimes wanting isn't enough. Sometimes you have to act." Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of raised voices from the house. Eleanor sighed. Her serene moment shattered. It seems peace is a fleeting thing in this family. Richard looked toward the house, his brow furrowing. "Do you think they'll ever change?" Eleanor's gaze turned distant, her thoughts heavy. "Change is a curious thing, Richard. It often comes at a price." As they sat in the garden, the sun climbing higher in the sky, Eleanor felt a flicker of determination. The storm brewing within her family couldn't be ignored any longer, and the next move would be hers to make. By the time the afternoon sunlight had begun to wane, casting long shadows across the estate's sprawling grounds, the tension in the Hathaway household had reached a new peak. Eleanor remained in her study, silently observing the chaos she had set into motion. The blue notebook rested open on the desk before her, its pages filled with notes and observations about her children. Each entry captured a moment, a word, or a betrayal, woven together into a tapestry of her family's dysfunction. Downstairs, Sarah paced the drawing room, her sharp heels clicking against the wooden floor. She clutched her phone, her conversation with the financial consultant growing increasingly agitated. "No, that's not acceptable," she snapped. "We need access to those accounts immediately. There's no time for delays." Daniel, lounging on the sofa with a drink in hand, smirked at his sister's frustration. "Trouble managing the empire, Sarah?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Sarah shot him a glare. "If you're not going to contribute anything useful, Daniel, perhaps you should keep your comments to yourself." "Oh, I'm contributing," he said, raising his glass in mock salute, "by staying out of your way." Emma entered the room then, her expression taut with restrained anger. "Can't either of you see what's happening?" she demanded. "You're both playing right into her hands." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly do you think is happening, Emma?" "She's testing us," Emma said, her voice trembling. "She's watching every move we make, waiting to see how far we'll go." Sarah scoffed, brushing past Emma to place her phone on the mantel. "Don't be ridiculous. Mother's not playing some elaborate game. She's losing control, and someone needs to step up before everything falls apart." Emma shook her head, her frustration mounting. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about the estate, it's about us, about the family. But you're so obsessed with control, you can't see it." "And you're so naive," Sarah retorted, her voice icy. "Do you honestly believe this is about some sentimental notion of family unity? Grow up, Emma." The argument threatened to escalate further when Claire appeared in the doorway, her expression calm but firm. "Mrs. Hathaway has asked to see all of you in the study," she announced. Immediately, the siblings exchanged wary glances, each wondering what new challenge awaited them. Daniel drained the rest of his drink and rose from the sofa, while Sarah adjusted her blazer with practiced composure. Emma lingered for a moment, her hesitation betraying the unease she felt. When they entered the study, Eleanor was seated behind her desk, her posture regal despite the cane resting against her chair. The late afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, casting a golden glow over the room. Richard stood near the bookshelf, his presence a quiet counterpoint to the tension radiating from the others. Eleanor's gaze swept over her children, taking in their guarded expressions. She let the silence linger, the weight of her scrutiny pressing down on them. "Do you know what I've been thinking about?" Eleanor said finally, her voice calm but deliberate. "Legacies. What we leave behind, and how we're remembered." Sarah shifted uncomfortably, while Daniel leaned against the edge of the desk, his arms crossed. Emma stayed near the door, her arms folded protectively across her chest. "I've spent my life building something enduring," Eleanor continued, "not just wealth, but influence, stability. And yet, as I watch the three of you, I can't help but wonder, what was it all for?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Richard, standing silently, glanced at his grandmother, his expression troubled. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharpening. "You've spent these past days arguing, scheming, and maneuvering against one another. Is this what I've raised? A family that values ambition over loyalty, pride over love. Mother, that's not fair," Sarah began, but Eleanor held up a hand to silence her. "Fair," Eleanor echoed, her voice firm. "What's fair is that I gave each of you every advantage I could, and yet you've squandered it with your petty rivalries and self-interest." Emma stepped forward then, her voice trembling with emotion. "We're not perfect, Mom, but we're still your children." "Doesn't that mean anything?" Eleanor's expression softened, though her tone remained measured. "It means everything, Emma. That's why this is so painful to watch." For a moment, the room was silent, the siblings grappling with the weight of Eleanor's words. Richard shifted uncomfortably, the tension in the room palpable. "I've decided," Eleanor said at last, "that things cannot go on like this. I won't allow this family to destroy itself." The declaration sent a ripple through the room, each sibling reacting in their own way. Sarah with a flicker of alarm, Daniel with wary curiosity, and Emma with quiet determination. Eleanor rose slowly, leaning on her cane for support. "I'll be making changes," she said, her voice steady, "to my will, to my estate, to everything." The announcement landed like a thunderclap, the implications reverberating through the room. As Eleanor made her way toward the door, Richard stepped forward, his voice soft but firm. "Grandma, are you sure about this?" Eleanor paused, her gaze meeting his. "More sure than I've ever been, Richard." She left the room then, her cane tapping softly against the floor, leaving her children and grandson to grapple with the storm she had just unleashed. The Hathaway estate had become a battlefield of unspoken tensions and simmering resentments. The siblings moved around the house like chess pieces, each plotting their next move while trying to predict the others. Eleanor, from her perch in the study, observed the undercurrents with the detached focus of a seasoned strategist. Yet even she could not have anticipated the arrival of an unexpected ally. Claire, her loyal nurse, entered the room late in the evening. She was uncharacteristically hesitant, her movements lacking the usual efficiency. Eleanor looked up from her notebook, raising an eyebrow. "What is it, Claire?" she asked, her tone gentle but curious. Claire hesitated, clutching the edge of the tray she carried. "Mrs. Hathaway, I think we need to talk." Eleanor gestured for her to sit, sensing something important was coming. "Go on," she said. Claire sat down, her hands folding tightly in her lap. "I know it's not my place, but I've been watching what's happening, and I'm worried about you." "About them?" Eleanor leaned back, studying her nurse with sharp eyes. "And what, precisely, concerns you?" Claire hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "This plan of yours, it's risky. You're pushing them to their limits, and I don't know if they can handle it. I'm afraid it might do more harm than good." Eleanor's expression softened slightly, though her resolve remained firm. "Claire, do you think I enjoy this? Watching my children tear at each other like wolves. This isn't about cruelty, it's about truth." "But at what cost?" Claire asked, her voice almost pleading. "They're not just fighting over the estate anymore. They're fighting because they're lost, because they don't know how to be a family without you holding them together." The words struck Eleanor more deeply than she let on. She folded her hands on the desk, her gaze distant. "You think I should stop? I think you need to consider what you really want, Mrs. Hathaway," Claire said gently. "Do you want to leave behind a legacy of love or one of regret?" Eleanor nodded slowly, her mind working through Claire's words. "Thank you, Claire. Your honesty is appreciated." The conversation ended there, but Claire's words lingered in Eleanor's mind as she prepared for bed that night. She had spent so long orchestrating this test, determined to expose her children's true natures. But what if the test was breaking them instead of revealing their strength? The following morning, a new player entered the fray. Margaret, Eleanor's distant cousin who had arrived days earlier, had kept to the background until now, watching the unfolding drama with keen interest. Her opportunism had not gone unnoticed, but her intentions remained ambiguous until she sought out Eleanor in the garden. "Aunt Eleanor," Margaret said as she approached, her tone carefully warm, "may I join you?" Eleanor, seated on a wrought-iron bench near the rose garden, gestured for Margaret to sit. "What is it, Margaret? I assume you didn't come all this way just to admire my roses." Margaret smiled faintly, folding her hands in her lap. "I wanted to talk to you about the family, about what's happening here." Eleanor arched an eyebrow. "And what exactly do you think is happening?" Margaret's smile tightened, though she maintained her composure. "I think they're lost, Aunt Eleanor. They're so caught up in their own fears and ambitions that they can't see what really matters." Eleanor studied Margaret carefully, noting the faint undertone of calculation in her voice. "And what, in your opinion, really matters?" "Family," Margaret said simply. "It's what brought me here after all. I couldn't bear the thought of you going through this alone." Eleanor's expression remained neutral, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of amusement. "How noble of you!" Margaret hesitated, sensing the subtle challenge in Eleanor's tone. "I only want to help," she said earnestly. "I know I haven't always been close to you or the others, but that doesn't mean I don't care." Eleanor leaned back, her gaze never leaving Margaret's face. "Help, you say? And what form would this help take?" Margaret faltered for a moment before recovering. "Mediation, perhaps. Someone to remind them of what's at stake." Eleanor smiled faintly, though it was a smile devoid of warmth. "You're quite the diplomat, Margaret. But let me be clear. I don't need a mediator. What I need is for my children to prove themselves capable of something more than greed." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but closed it again, realizing there was little she could say to sway Eleanor. She rose gracefully, smoothing her skirt. "Of course, Aunt Eleanor, I only want what's best for you." As Margaret walked away, Eleanor's smile faded. The garden, once her sanctuary, now felt like another stage for the battles playing out within her family. She glanced toward the house, where she could see Richard standing in the library window, watching the scene unfold. His quiet presence was a small comfort amid the growing storm. Eleanor returned to the bench, her thoughts heavy. Claire's warning and Margaret's overtures had shaken her resolve, but they had also clarified her purpose. This was no longer just a test, it was a reckoning, and she would see it through to the end, no matter the cost. The Hathaway estate was caught in a tense equilibrium, the kind that preceded an inevitable collapse. Eleanor's declaration of changes to her will had rattled her children, and the air was now thick with suspicion. Each sibling retreated into their corner, each nursing their own interpretation of what her words might mean. But it was Eleanor's deliberate behavior that now began to sow deeper uncertainty. In the days following her announcement, Eleanor's supposed condition seemed to worsen. She would trail off mid-sentence, confuse dates, or refer to long-dead acquaintances as if they were still alive. Claire, faithful to the ruse, corroborated the narrative, her demeanor a careful balance of concern and professionalism. This only heightened the siblings' paranoia, their fear and greed masquerading as worry. Sarah, ever pragmatic, saw this as an opportunity to act. Seated in her bedroom with Daniel, she outlined her plan. A sleek laptop sat on the desk between them, illuminated by the soft glow of a nearby lamp. "I've already reached out to a legal consultant," Sarah said, her tone clipped. "The process to secure power of attorney is straightforward, but it will require cooperation, or at least the appearance of it." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "And what exactly does cooperation mean in this case?" "You want me to play nice? I want you to sign the papers," Sarah replied, her patience visibly fraying. "This isn't about you or me, it's about protecting the estate." Daniel smirked. "And by protecting, you mean ensuring you have control." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Don't be childish, Daniel. Mother is clearly unwell. Someone has to take charge." "Unwell?" Daniel scoffed. "She's sharp as ever, Sarah. This whole memory loss act doesn't fool me for a second." "And yet you're still here," Sarah shot back. "If you didn't believe there was something to gain, you'd have left days ago." Daniel's smirk faded, replaced by a hard edge in his gaze. "Fine. I'll sign your papers, but don't think for a second that I trust you." Their uneasy alliance solidified, but it was clear that trust was a currency neither sibling was willing to spend. Meanwhile, Emma lingered in the library, her mind swirling with doubts. She had overheard parts of Sarah and Daniel's conversation and felt the weight of their machinations pressing down on her. Unlike her siblings, Emma had no legal acumen or business sense to guide her. She relied on intuition, and her instincts told her something was deeply wrong. Late that evening, Emma sought out Eleanor, finding her mother seated by the fire in the drawing room. The flames cast flickering shadows across Eleanor's face, highlighting the sharp contours of her cheekbones and the steady determination in her eyes. "Mom," Emma began hesitantly, "can we talk?" Eleanor looked up, her expression unreadable. "Of course, Emma. Sit." Emma perched on the edge of a nearby chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't know what's happening anymore. Sarah and Daniel are plotting. Margaret's hovering like a vulture. And She hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't know what to do." Eleanor studied her daughter for a long moment before speaking. "What is it you're afraid of, Emma?" "I'm afraid of losing you," Emma admitted, her voice trembling. "Not just to whatever this is, but to them, to all of this." Eleanor's expression softened, though her voice remained steady. "Do you think they care about losing me?" Emma looked away, her silence an answer in itself. Eleanor leaned forward, her gaze intense. "Emma, this family is at a crossroads. What happens next will define us for years to come. But I need to know, what are you willing to fight for?" Emma met her mother's gaze, her eyes filling with unshed tears. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." "You are," Eleanor said firmly. "You've always been stronger than you think." The next day brought new complications. Sarah, true to her word, moved forward with her plan to secure power of attorney, enlisting Daniel's begrudging support. They approached Margaret, who had been keeping her distance since her failed overtures to Eleanor. "Margaret," Sarah said, her tone crisp, "we need to talk." Margaret raised an eyebrow, her expression wary. About ensuring Mother's affairs are handled properly," Sarah replied. "With her condition worsening, it's imperative that we act quickly." Margaret's smile was thin. "And you think I'll just fall in line?" "I think you care about this family," Sarah said, her voice carefully measured, "and about your place in it." Margaret considered this for a moment before nodding. "Fine, but if I'm going to help, I want assurances." "Of course," Sarah said, though the flicker in her eyes betrayed her disdain. As the alliance between Sarah, Daniel, and Margaret took shape, Emma found herself increasingly isolated. But her conversation with Eleanor lingered in her mind, igniting a spark of resolve. For the first time, Emma realized that the battle for her family's future was not just about the estate. It was about reclaiming the love and unity that had been lost. Eleanor watched these developments with quiet determination. The pieces were moving, the board shifting. The time for revelations was fast approaching, and Eleanor knew the next move would be hers to make. The tension in the Hathaway estate reached an almost unbearable crescendo. It was as though the house itself had absorbed the strain, its grand halls and ornate rooms echoing with unresolved arguments and whispered schemes. Eleanor, from her vantage point in the study, felt the weight of her children's choices pressing against her resolve. But it wasn't until Emma stumbled upon a damning discovery that the fragile balance began to shatter. Emma, seeking solace from the charged atmosphere, had taken to wandering the less used corners of the estate. It was in the small office near the West Wing that she found a folder left carelessly open on the desk, a folder with her mother's name emblazoned on its cover. Drawn by a mix of curiosity and unease, she hesitated only briefly before opening it. Her eyes scanned the documents inside, and her heart sank. They outlined transactions, siphoning funds from one of Eleanor's smaller businesses, transfers authorized by none other than Daniel. The dates stretched back years, the amounts modest at first, but growing bolder with time. Emma felt a surge of anger, not just at Daniel's betrayal, but at the audacity of it. She clutched the folder, her hands trembling as she debated her next move. That evening, Emma confronted Daniel in the drawing room. He was alone, nursing a glass of whiskey and staring into the crackling fire, his expression unreadable. She entered without preamble, the folder clutched tightly in her hands. "Explain this," she demanded, her voice sharp. Daniel turned, his brow furrowing as he saw the folder. "What are you talking about?" Emma tossed it onto the table between them, the papers spilling out like an accusation. "You've been stealing from Mom's businesses for years." Daniel's face darkened, but he quickly schooled his expression into one of indifference. "I wouldn't call it stealing," he said coolly. "More like reallocating." "Reallocating?" Emma's voice rose. "You've been taking money behind her back, and you're pretending it's nothing." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his demeanor maddeningly calm. "Don't be so dramatic, Emma. It's not like she even noticed. Besides, I've done more for this family than you ever have." "That doesn't give you the right," Emma shot back, her voice shaking. "She trusted you, Daniel, and you've been lying to her this whole time." Daniel stood, his height imposing as he loomed over her. "Don't pretend you're some moral authority. You've spent most of your life running away from this family. At least I stayed." "To do what?" Emma countered, her anger matching his. "Bleed her dry while pretending to care." Their argument drew Sarah, who entered the room with her usual air of authority. She glanced between them, her sharp mind quickly piecing together the situation. "What's going on here?" Sarah demanded. Emma turned to her, her voice thick with emotion. "Daniel's been stealing from Mom's businesses for years." Sarah's expression froze, her lawyer's instincts kicking in. "What proof do you have?" Emma gestured to the folder. It's all there. Transfers, dates, amounts, everything. Sarah picked up the papers, her lips pressing into a thin line as she scanned them. This is serious, Daniel. Daniel's confidence faltered for the first time. Look, it's not what it seems. I had reasons. Reasons, Sarah cut him off, her tone icy. You think there's a justification for this? If Mom finds out, she won't, Daniel interrupted, his voice hard. Not if you keep quiet. Emma's eyes widened. You think we're just going to cover for you? Daniel turned to her, his expression desperate now. If you don't, you'll blow everything up. Do you really want to add more chaos to this mess? Sarah closed the folder with a snap, her expression unreadable. This isn't just about you, Daniel. If this gets out, it could damage all of us. Emma stared at her sister in disbelief. You can't be serious. He's been stealing from Mom, and you're worried about damage control. Sarah turned to Emma, her voice calm but cold. I'm worried about protecting what's left of this family. Upstairs, Eleanor sat in her study, unaware of the confrontation unfolding below. But she wasn't blind to the signs, the raised voices, the tension that seemed to hum through the house. She glanced at Claire, who stood nearby, her expression carefully neutral. They're unraveling, Eleanor murmured. Claire hesitated before responding. And you're certain this is what you wanted? Eleanor's gaze turned distant, her mind heavy with doubt. Wanting has nothing to do with it, she said softly. It's what was necessary. The night wore on, the Hathaway estate steeped in conflict. Emma, torn between loyalty and justice, retreated to her room, the weight of her discovery pressing heavily on her. Daniel, shaken but defiant, poured himself another drink, his mind racing with plans to regain control. And Sarah, ever the strategist, began drafting contingencies, her lawyer's instincts at war with her conscience. Eleanor, sitting alone in the quiet of her study, opened her blue notebook once more. The words she wrote were measured, deliberate, each stroke of the pen a step closer to the revelation she knew was inevitable. Eleanor sat alone in the grand dining room as the morning light spilled through the tall windows. The long table, once a place for joyful family dinners, now seemed to stretch endlessly before her, a stark reminder of the chasm growing among her children. She sipped her tea slowly, her hands steady, despite the storm she knew was brewing within the walls of her estate. Today, she had decided, was the day to act. She summoned Claire to her side with the press of a small brass bell on the table. When the nurse entered, her demeanor calm but alert, Eleanor looked up from her seat. Claire, Eleanor began, her voice quiet but firm. I need you to arrange a family meeting this evening. Everyone must attend. Sarah, Daniel, Emma, Richard, even Margaret. Claire hesitated, her brows knitting together in concern. Are you sure, Mrs. Hathaway? Things have been tense. All the more reason, Eleanor replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. It's time to address the fractures in this family and to reveal a few truths. Claire nodded, though her worry was evident. I'll make the arrangements. As the day wore on, the news of the meeting spread quickly through the household, each family member reacting in their own way. Sarah retreated to her room, poring over documents and weighing the risks of what Eleanor might say. Daniel paced the study, muttering to himself as he tried to anticipate his mother's intentions. Emma, restless and uneasy, sought solace in the garden, her thoughts a tangled web of anger and uncertainty. Even Margaret, who had maintained a careful distance, couldn't hide her curiosity about what Eleanor might have planned. By the time evening fell, the family had gathered in the drawing room. The air was heavy with anticipation, the tension so thick it seemed to stifle even the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Eleanor entered last, her cane tapping softly against the floor as Claire helped her to a seat near the head of the room. Thank you all for coming, Eleanor began, her voice steady despite her frail appearance. Her sharp gaze swept over her children and Margaret, lingering on each of them for a moment before continuing. I've called you here because I believe it's time for clarity, for honesty. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. No one spoke, though Sarah's clenched jaw and Daniel's restless movements betrayed their unease. For weeks, I've watched as this family has descended into chaos, Eleanor said. Schemes, betrayals, lies, all driven by fear and greed. And while I cannot pretend to be blameless in how we've come to this point, I also cannot remain silent any longer. Emma shifted in her seat, her eyes wide with apprehension. Mom, what are you saying? I'm saying, Eleanor replied, her voice firm, that I've had enough. Enough of the deception, enough of the manipulation. It's time for the truth to come out. She turned her gaze to Daniel, her expression unyielding. Daniel, you've been stealing from my businesses. Don't bother denying it. I've seen the evidence. Daniel's face paled, and for a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. I can explain. There is no explanation that will justify what you've done, Eleanor said sharply, cutting him off. You've betrayed not just me, but this family. Sarah, who had been silent until now, spoke up, her tone clipped. Mother, we can handle this internally. There's no need to air all of this. Eleanor turned to her eldest daughter, her gaze piercing. And you, Sarah, your constant need for control has blinded you to the damage you're causing. You claim to act in this family's best interests, but you've treated this house, this legacy, as if it were your personal battlefield. Sarah bristled but said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, Eleanor's eyes fell on Emma. Her tone softened, though her words still carried weight. Emma, of all my children, you've shown me glimpses of what this family could be. But even you have struggled to find your place, to stand firm against the tide. Emma's eyes filled with tears, though she held Eleanor's gaze. I'm trying, Mom. I really am. Eleanor nodded, her expression softening further. I know, my dear, and that's why I still have hope. The room fell silent once more as Eleanor took a deep breath, gathering her strength for what she knew was the hardest part. I've decided to make changes to my will, she announced. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. This family needs a wake-up call, and this is the only way I know to give it. The announcement landed like a thunderclap, each family member reacting in their own way. Sarah's face froze in a mask of controlled fury. Daniel's hands clenched into fists, and Emma's expression wavered between shock and relief. Margaret, ever the opportunist, simply leaned back in her chair, her eyes glittering with intrigue. I will reveal the specifics when the time is right, Eleanor continued, but know this, my decisions are final. I will not tolerate further deceit or division. She rose slowly, with Claire's help, her frailty more apparent now than ever. This family has lost its way, she said, her voice trembling slightly, but it is not beyond redemption. The choice to rebuild lies with each of you. With that, Eleanor left the room, her cane tapping softly against the floor as she disappeared down the hall. The silence she left behind was deafening, each family member consumed by their own thoughts, their own regrets, and their own fears. The atmosphere in the Hathaway estate grew heavy with the weight of Eleanor's announcement. As the night deepened, shadows from the flickering firelight danced across the walls of the drawing room where the family remained seated, each grappling with the implications of what had just transpired. The silence between them was brittle, punctuated only by the occasional crackle of the fire. Eleanor's words hung over them like an unrelenting storm cloud. Sarah was the first to break the silence. Her voice was sharp, laced with the measured calm of someone accustomed to negotiating deals under pressure. "This doesn't have to be as dire as it sounds," she began, though her knuckles whitened as she gripped the arm of her chair. "We can still salvage this, provided we work together." "Work together?" Emma snapped, her incredulity cutting through the room. "Since when have we ever worked together, Sarah? You've spent years undermining everyone around you. Daniel's been stealing, and Margaret—" Emma gestured toward their cousin, who sat smugly in the corner, her expression unreadable. "Well, I don't even know why she's here." Margaret raised an eyebrow, her tone syrupy as she replied, "I'm here, dear Emma, because family matters. I'm sorry if that offends your sensibilities." Emma stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You're here because you see an opportunity, just like everyone else. Don't pretend you care about anything other than yourself." "Enough!" Sarah snapped, her voice ringing with authority. "Fighting among ourselves will only make things worse. We need to stay focused." "Focused on what?" Daniel cut in, his words slurred slightly from the whiskey he hadn't stopped drinking since the announcement. "Sarah, you're not fooling anyone. You just want control. Always have. And you," he said, pointing at Emma, "act like you're above it all, but you've been waiting for your chance too." Emma's eyes narrowed. "My chance? Chance for what, Daniel? To scrape by while you and Sarah divvy up the spoils?" Margaret leaned forward, her voice low and cutting. "Perhaps we should all take a moment to reflect before this spirals further. The more we argue, the more vulnerable we make ourselves." Sarah turned to her, her gaze icy. "Don't pretend you're neutral in this, Margaret. You've been circling like a hawk since you arrived." Margaret smiled faintly, though the glint in her eyes betrayed her calm exterior. "I'm simply observing, Sarah. And right now, you're not making a very compelling case for leadership." The tension in the room boiled over, voices rising as accusations flew. It was Richard who finally intervened, his voice steady but firm as he spoke from the corner where he had been watching in silence. "Stop it," he said, his tone cutting through the chaos. "All of you, don't you see what's happening? Grandma wanted us to hear this together for a reason. She's not trying to pit us against each other. We're doing that on our own." The room fell silent, his words a sobering reminder of what was at stake. Richard met each of their gazes in turn, his expression resolute. "If we don't figure this out, we'll lose more than just the estate. We'll lose the only thing we have left, each other." For a moment, no one spoke. The truth of Richard's words settled over them like a heavy blanket, smothering their anger but not their unease. Sarah cleared her throat, her voice softer now. "Richard's right. We've let this situation get the better of us." "Situation?" Emma repeated, her tone incredulous. "You mean the fact that Daniel's been stealing? Or that Margaret is circling like a vulture? Or maybe the part where you've been manipulating everyone since the day you became a lawyer?" Sarah flinched but didn't respond, her composure cracking slightly under Emma's accusations. Daniel, meanwhile, leaned back in his chair, a bitter laugh escaping him. "At least I'm honest about what I've done," he muttered. Margaret's smile widened, though she said nothing, content to let the others destroy one another. Richard sighed, rubbing his temples as he tried to quell the rising tide of frustration within himself. "I don't think Grandma's giving us a choice," Richard said finally, his voice weary but determined. "She's forcing us to face this, to face each other. Maybe it's time we listened." His words struck a chord, and for the first time that evening, the siblings fell quiet. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shift in the room, while Sarah and Emma exchanged wary glances. Daniel stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. Upstairs, Eleanor sat in her study, her cane resting against the arm of her chair as she gazed out the window. Claire stood nearby, her expression a mix of concern and admiration. "You think they'll find a way through this?" Claire asked softly. Eleanor didn't turn, her gaze fixed on the darkened garden below. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I had to try. Sometimes, to rebuild, you have to let everything fall apart first." The room fell silent again, the weight of Eleanor's gamble pressing heavily on both women. Below, the fire in the drawing room flickered and danced, casting long shadows across the faces of a family teetering on the edge of redemption or ruin. The next morning, a somber quiet settled over the Hathaway estate, broken only by the muffled sounds of footsteps on the wooden floors. The family scattered throughout the house, each carrying the weight of their own thoughts after the stormy confrontation the night before. Eleanor's decision to force them into reckoning had left deep cracks in the fragile foundations they shared, and now, it seemed, everything teetered on the edge of collapse. Eleanor, sitting in her study with Claire nearby, gazed out the window at the overcast sky. The garden below, once her sanctuary, seemed lifeless, its vibrant colors dulled by the gray morning light. "Do you think they'll come to their senses, Claire?" Eleanor asked softly, her voice tinged with weariness. Claire hesitated, pouring tea into Eleanor's favorite porcelain cup. "They might, but it's not easy for people to face their worst selves. Mrs. Hathaway, sometimes it takes more than words." Eleanor nodded, a faint sigh escaping her lips. "Then perhaps I've done all I can." Downstairs, Emma sat alone in the sunroom, her sketchbook resting on her lap. The pages were blank. Her usually vivid imagination was clouded by the turmoil swirling in her mind. She'd always felt out of place in the Hathaway family, an artist among pragmatists, a dreamer among schemers. But now, as her siblings' flaws and betrayals were laid bare, she wondered if she had been blind to her own shortcomings. Richard entered the room quietly, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. "You okay?" he asked, breaking the silence. Emma looked up, forcing a faint smile. "As okay as I can be, given the circumstances." Richard sat beside her, his expression serious. "Do you think Grandma's trying to punish us?" Emma shook her head. "No, I think she's trying to wake us up. But I don't know if we're capable of listening." Richard hesitated, then spoke with a conviction that belied his age. "I think you are. You've always been the one who cared the most, even if you didn't know how to show it." Emma blinked, taken aback by his words. Before she could respond, Sarah's voice echoed from the hallway. "Family meeting, now." In the drawing room, the family assembled once again, their unease palpable. Sarah stood at the center, her composure carefully maintained as she addressed them. "Mother's decision changes everything," she began, her voice measured. "And if we're going to navigate this, we need to approach it rationally." Daniel, sprawled in a chair with a drink in hand, snorted. "Rationally? That's rich, coming from you." Sarah ignored him, her gaze focused on Emma. "You've been quiet, Emma. Do you have anything to say?" Emma hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edges of her sketchbook. "What's the point? Every time I try to speak, I get dismissed." "You and Daniel have already decided how this will play out." Daniel raised his glass in mock agreement. "She's got a point." "Enough!" Sarah snapped, her patience fraying. "This isn't about sides. This is about saving what's left of this family." "And who decided you were the one to save it?" Emma shot back, her voice rising. Margaret, who had been watching silently from the corner, finally spoke. "Perhaps it's time we stop pretending that anyone here has the moral high ground. Sarah wants control, Daniel wants money, Emma wants validation, and she smiled faintly, "I just want to see how this plays out." Her words cut through the room like a blade, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but Richard interrupted, his voice firm. "You're all missing the point," he said. "Grandma's not doing this to punish us or test us. She's doing it because she's scared of what we've become." The room fell silent again, his words sinking in. Sarah looked away, her jaw tightening. Daniel stared into his drink, while Emma's gaze dropped to her lap. Even Margaret seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Richard stepped forward, his voice softer now. "If we don't figure this out, we'll lose her. And maybe that's what she's trying to show us, that if we don't change, we'll lose each other too." Upstairs, Eleanor sat in her armchair, listening to the faint sounds of their conversation below. Claire stood beside her, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "They're talking," Claire said quietly. "That's a start." Eleanor nodded, her gaze distant. "Talking isn't enough. They need to truly see what's at stake." "What will you do if they don't?" Claire asked gently. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. When she spoke, her voice was soft but resolute. "Then I'll have to show them." The weight of her words lingered as she leaned back in her chair, her mind racing with the realization that the time for subtlety had passed. If her children couldn't rise above their worst instincts, she would force them to confront the consequences of their choices, even if it meant risking everything she had worked so hard to build. The tension in the Hathaway estate reached an unbearable crescendo as the family descended into another evening of terse silences and strained glances. Eleanor, secluded in her study, weighed her next move with the precision of a general preparing for battle. The stakes were higher now. Her children's fractures ran deeper than she had anticipated. A devastating sacrifice would be necessary to force them to confront not only each other but themselves. That night, Eleanor called Claire into the study. The loyal nurse, her face lined with concern, sat opposite Eleanor, awaiting the matriarch's instructions. "It's time, Claire," Eleanor said softly, her voice carrying a solemn weight. "The truth must come out." Claire hesitated, her hands folding tightly in her lap. "Are you sure, Mrs. Hathaway? Once this is done, there's no going back." Eleanor met Claire's gaze, her own steady despite the turmoil inside her. This family needs to see what it has become. If they cannot rebuild from the ashes, then it was never a family to begin with. The following morning, the family was summoned to the drawing room. The siblings entered one by one, their faces etched with suspicion and fatigue. Margaret, as always, hung back near the door, her expression carefully neutral. Richard lingered in the corner, his presence steady but uncertain. Eleanor was already seated in her usual spot, the blue notebook resting on the small table beside her. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Once everyone had gathered, Eleanor began to speak. "I've called you here because there's something you all need to hear," she said, her tone calm but commanding. "For years, I have watched this family crumble under the weight of its own ambition and resentment. And now, it seems, we have reached a breaking point." She gestured to Claire, who stepped forward with a bundle of papers in her hands. "Claire has been helping me document the actions and decisions of each of you. What you're about to hear is not my judgment. It is simply the truth." The room grew deathly quiet as Claire began to read. She started with Sarah, recounting her secret attempts to secure power of attorney and her behind-the-scenes maneuvering to gain control of the estate. Sarah's face remained stoic, though her clenched fists betrayed her tension. Next came Daniel. The documents revealed the extent of his theft from Eleanor's businesses, each transaction laid bare for the family to see. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his usual bravado replaced by a sullen silence. When it was Emma's turn, Claire hesitated. Eleanor nodded for her to continue. The revelations about Emma were less damning but no less impactful. Her years of absence, her unwillingness to engage with the family, and the ways in which she had distanced herself from the very people who needed her most. Emma's face flushed with shame, tears pooling in her eyes. Finally, Claire turned to Margaret. The documents detailed her opportunistic behavior, her attempts to position herself as a beneficiary of Eleanor's wealth, despite her tenuous connection to the family. Margaret's mask of composure cracked, her lips tightening as she realized the extent of Eleanor's awareness. When Claire finished, the silence that followed was suffocating. Each family member avoided the other's eyes, the weight of their collective failings pressing down on them like a physical force. Eleanor leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "This is what we've become," she said quietly, "a family driven by greed, mistrust, and self-interest. Do you see now why I had to act? Do you see what we are at risk of losing?" Emma was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "Mom, I'm sorry. For everything. I didn't realize how much I'd let you down." Eleanor's expression softened, though she remained composed. "It's not me you've let down, Emma. It's yourself." Sarah, her composure finally breaking, turned to Eleanor. "Mother, I only wanted to protect the family. I didn't mean for it to become this." "And yet it has," Eleanor replied, her voice tinged with sadness. "Intentions mean nothing if the actions they drive cause harm." Daniel, for once, said nothing. He stared into the fire, his jaw clenched, the weight of his guilt evident in the set of his shoulders. Margaret, too, remained silent, her usual confidence replaced by unease. Eleanor took a deep breath, her hands resting on the arms of her chair. "I've rewritten my will," she announced, her voice firm. "And the changes reflect not only what you've done, but what I believe you are capable of becoming. This family is at a crossroads. Whether we heal or destroy each other from here is entirely up to you." The room erupted into hushed murmurs and furtive glances. Each person processed the announcement in their own way, their minds racing with the implications. Richard, standing quietly in the corner, finally stepped forward. "Grandma," he said, his voice steady, "do you still believe we can fix this?" Eleanor met his gaze, her eyes glistening. "I do, but only if each of you is willing to make sacrifices of your own." With those words, she rose slowly, leaning on Claire for support. "I've done what I can. The rest is up to you." As she left the room, the firelight casting her shadow across the walls, the family was left to grapple with the enormity of her sacrifice and the daunting task of rebuilding what had been broken. The days following Eleanor's announcement were a quiet storm of reflection and unease. The once bustling and tense halls of the Hathaway estate seemed muted as each member of the family retreated into their own corners, grappling with the truths Eleanor had laid bare. The blue notebook, now synonymous with revelations, remained on Eleanor's desk, a silent reminder of her unflinching assessment of her family's flaws. Eleanor, however, was not immune to the weight of what had transpired. She spent her mornings in the study, staring out at the grey skies that stretched over the garden, her tea untouched on the small side table. Claire, ever the watchful confidant, lingered nearby, though she offered no words unless Eleanor spoke first. It was in one such moment of solitude that Emma found her. Her presence was hesitant, her movements quieter than usual as she stepped into the room. Eleanor turned at the sound of the door, her sharp gaze softening slightly at the sight of her youngest daughter. "Emma," she said, her voice low but steady, "what brings you here?" Emma crossed the room slowly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I needed to talk to you." Eleanor gestured to the chair opposite her, and Emma sat, her posture tense as if bracing for a reprimand. But Eleanor said nothing, waiting for her daughter to speak. "I've been thinking," Emma began, her voice trembling slightly. "About what you said, about all of us, about me." Eleanor's expression remained neutral, though her eyes held a glimmer of curiosity. "And what have you concluded?" Emma looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "I've been running away from the family, from responsibility, from everything. And I think I've been scared. Scared that I'd never measure up to Sarah or Daniel, scared that I didn't belong." Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her gaze intent. And now, Emma met her mother's eyes, her own filled with determination. "Now, I want to be better. I want to try. Not for the inheritance or the estate, but for you, for us." For a moment, Eleanor said nothing, her expression inscrutable. Then she nodded slowly. "It takes courage to face yourself, Emma." "More than most people realize." Emma smiled faintly, the tension in her shoulders easing. "I just hope it's not too late." Elsewhere in the house, Sarah sat in the library, a stack of documents spread out before her. Her usual precision was absent. The papers were scattered haphazardly, her pen lying untouched beside them. She stared out the window, her thoughts far from the legal jargon that filled the pages. Daniel entered without knocking, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. "You look lost," he said, his tone devoid of its usual sarcasm. Sarah sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Maybe I am. For the first time in years, I don't know what the next move is." Daniel smirked faintly, though there was no malice in it. "Welcome to the club." Sarah glanced at him, her expression softening. "Have you thought about what she said?" "About what we've done?" Daniel shrugged, though his usual bravado seemed diminished. "I've thought about it. Doesn't change the fact that I screwed up." "Maybe it doesn't," Sarah replied. "But acknowledging it is a start." Daniel sank into the chair opposite her, his gaze distant. "You think we can fix this?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but I think we have to try. For her." That evening, the family gathered once again, this time without Eleanor's prompting. They met in the sitting room, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and resolve. Richard, as always, lingered near the edge of the group, his quiet presence grounding them. Emma was the first to speak. "I think we've all made mistakes, and I think Mom's right. We've let those mistakes define us." Sarah nodded, her gaze steady. "But we can choose differently. We can change." Daniel, uncharacteristically quiet, looked down at his hands. "I'm not sure I know how." "We figure it out," Richard said, his voice calm but firm. "Together." For the first time in weeks, a sense of unity began to emerge among them. The road ahead was uncertain, the fractures between them far from healed. But in that moment, there was a flicker of hope, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. Upstairs, Eleanor sat in her armchair, her hands resting on the arms as she gazed out at the moonlit garden. Claire stood nearby, her expression unreadable. "They're talking," Claire said softly. "It's a start." Eleanor nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "A start is all I ever wanted." The morning broke with a pale sun creeping over the sprawling grounds of the Hathaway estate, casting long shadows across the frost-laden grass. Inside the house, a hushed tension lingered, its occupants still reeling from Eleanor's revelations and the mirror she had held to their fractured relationships. Yet, the air carried an unspoken resolve. Something had shifted. Eleanor sat at the head of the dining table, her hands folded neatly before her. Claire stood nearby, her presence steady as always, though she carried an unusual air of anticipation. The blue notebook sat untouched beside Eleanor, a symbol of all the truths it had forced into the open. "I've decided to meet with each of them," Eleanor said, breaking the silence. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of finality. "One by one, I need to know if there's still something worth salvaging." Claire hesitated, her gaze searching Eleanor's face. "Are you certain? They're all still fragile?" Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile. "Fragile, yes. But perhaps that's what makes them open to change." The first meeting was with Sarah. Eleanor had requested that she join her in the study, the room where so much of her life's work had been planned and executed. Sarah entered with her usual composure, though there was a hint of hesitation in her stride. "Mother," Sarah began, taking a seat opposite Eleanor. "You wanted to see me?" Eleanor studied her eldest daughter, noting the tension in her shoulders, the fine lines of weariness etched into her face. "Yes, Sarah, I wanted to speak with you about what comes next." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "I understand that my actions, my decisions, haven't always been what you wanted, but everything I've done has been for the family." Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Have you asked yourself, Sarah, if the family wanted what you've been offering, or if it was only what you thought best?" The question caught Sarah off guard, her carefully constructed defenses faltering. I don't know," she admitted after a moment. "I suppose I never thought to ask." Eleanor's expression softened, though her voice remained firm. "Sarah, your intelligence, your strength, they are assets this family needs. But they mean nothing if they aren't tempered with humility and compassion. The kind of leadership we need now is not about control, it's about trust." Sarah looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the thin gold band on her right ring finger. "I don't know if I can change, Mother." "You can," Eleanor said simply, "if you choose to." Next was Daniel. He arrived at the study with none of his usual bravado, his movements hesitant as he approached Eleanor's desk. She motioned for him to sit, and he did so, his gaze avoiding hers. "Daniel," Eleanor began, her tone steady but not unkind, "you've made mistakes, but you already know that." Daniel nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I've been a screw-up my whole life, Mom. I've taken more than I deserve, hurt more than I meant to. I don't know how to fix it." Eleanor's gaze softened, though her voice carried a quiet resolve. "The first step is always the hardest, Daniel. Acknowledge what you've done, not just to me, but to your siblings, and then decide if you want to be better." Daniel's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something she hadn't seen in years: sincerity. "I do," he said. "I want to try." Emma came last, her steps light but uncertain as she entered the room. Eleanor smiled faintly at the sight of her youngest daughter, gesturing for her to sit. "Emma," Eleanor said gently, "I know you've struggled to find your place in this family, to feel like you belong." Emma nodded, her eyes glistening. "I've always felt like the odd one out, like I was never enough." Eleanor reached across the desk, placing her hand over Emma's. "You've always been enough, Emma. Your kindness, your creativity, they are the heart of this family, but you must believe in yourself as much as I do." Emma's tears spilled over, and she nodded. "I'll try, Mom." By evening, the family gathered once more in the drawing room at Eleanor's request. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth a contrast to the chill of the winter evening outside. Eleanor stood before them, her cane steadying her as she addressed the room. "I have spoken with each of you," she began, her voice calm but commanding. "And I have seen something I feared was lost: hope." Her gaze swept over her children and Margaret, lingering on each of them in turn. "The decisions I've made about the estate, about my legacy, were not meant to punish you. They were meant to remind you of what truly matters. This family has endured much, but we are still standing. That means there is still time to rebuild." Eleanor paused, letting her words settle. "The choice is yours now. To let go of resentment, to forgive, To move forward together. I will not make that choice for you. As Eleanor sat down, a heavy silence filled the room, but it was Richard who spoke first, his voice steady and sure. We'll make it work, Grandma, for you, for all of us. The room remained quiet, but the flicker of unity that had begun to grow among them was unmistakable. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of peace. The morning after Eleanor's heartfelt plea dawned crisp and bright, the sunlight pouring into the Hathaway estate with a rare warmth that seemed to mirror the tentative peace within its walls. Though the house was quieter than it had been in weeks, the silence was no longer oppressive. It was contemplative, as though the family was holding its breath, unsure of what might come next. Eleanor, seated in her study as always, gazed out the window at the frost-dusted garden. Her blue notebook lay closed on the desk beside her, its pages no longer a source of turmoil, but a testament to what had been endured. Claire entered the room quietly, carrying a tray with Eleanor's tea. "They're different this morning," Claire said softly, setting the tray down. "Calmer. Reflective." Eleanor turned to her, her lips curving into a faint smile. "It's amazing, isn't it? The clarity that comes after a storm." Claire nodded, though her expression remained cautious. "Do you think it will last?" Eleanor sighed, her gaze drifting back to the window. "I don't know. But I believe they've begun to see each other, not as rivals or obstacles, but as family. That's all I ever wanted." Downstairs, the siblings moved through the house with an air of unspoken understanding. Sarah, usually the first to isolate herself in moments of uncertainty, lingered in the kitchen, making coffee as though it were a peace offering. Emma entered quietly, her sketchbook tucked under one arm. "Morning," Emma said, her voice tentative. Sarah glanced at her, offering a small smile. "Morning?" Emma hesitated, then moved to pour herself a cup of coffee. "I was thinking," she began, her words slow and careful, "about what Mom said." "About rebuilding," Sarah nodded, her fingers tightening slightly around her mug. "Me too." They stood in silence for a moment before Sarah spoke again, her voice softer now. "I've always envied you, you know, your freedom, the way you see the world." Emma blinked, caught off guard. "You envied me." Sarah's smile was faint, but genuine. "Yes, you've always had something I couldn't grasp, an ability to dream beyond what's in front of you. I've spent my whole life trying to control everything, and I think I lost sight of what really matters." Emma didn't respond immediately, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and regret. Finally, she reached out, placing a hand on her sister's arm. "We've both made mistakes, but maybe it's not too late to fix them." Sarah met her gaze, her smile growing. "Maybe not." In the library, Daniel sat with Richard, the two of them sharing a rare moment of quiet camaraderie. Richard, with his usual thoughtfulness, was flipping through one of Eleanor's old photo albums, the pages filled with snapshots of their family in happier times. "Hard to believe we were ever that close," Daniel said, his voice tinged with regret. Richard glanced at him, his expression thoughtful. "We can be again," Daniel laughed softly, though there was little humor in it. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," Richard admitted, "but it's possible, if you're willing to try." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the photo album. "You're a lot like her, you know, Grandma," Richard's brow furrowed. "I don't know about that." Daniel shook his head. "You are. You see things the rest of us miss. And you're not afraid to call us out when we're being idiots." Richard smiled faintly, though his eyes were serious. "You're not an idiot, Uncle Daniel. You just forgot what's important." The words, simple yet profound, settled over Daniel like a balm. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope that he could be more than his mistakes. By afternoon, the family gathered in the sitting room at Richard's suggestion. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth a welcome reprieve from the chill outside. Eleanor joined them, her presence quiet but commanding, as she took her usual seat near the fire. It was Emma who spoke first, her voice steady but emotional. "We've been talking, Mom, about everything, and we want to do better, for you, for each other." Sarah nodded, her expression sincere. "You were right about us, about how far we've fallen. But we've realized that it's not too late to change." Daniel, uncharacteristically subdued, added, "I know I've made mistakes, more than my share, but I'm ready to make things right." Eleanor listened quietly, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and relief. She had spent so long fearing that her family was beyond repair, and now, in their eyes, she saw something she hadn't dared to hope for: unity. "You've made me proud," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "Not because you've promised to change, but because you've begun to see each other as I see you, as a family." The room fell silent, the weight of Eleanor's words settling over them. It was a moment of quiet triumph, a testament to the strength they had found in their shared vulnerability. As the afternoon faded into evening, the Hathaway family lingered together, their conversation turning from heavy to light, their laughter filling the house for the first time in years. Upstairs, the blue notebook sat forgotten on Eleanor's desk, its purpose fulfilled. For now, there was no need for reminders or revelations. There was only the hope of a new beginning. The days that followed felt like a quiet exhalation for the Hathaway family. The oppressive tension that had hung over the estate for weeks seemed to dissipate, replaced by a cautious sense of calm. Each member of the family began to carve out moments of reflection, and with those moments came tentative steps toward healing. Eleanor, ever the matriarch, found herself unexpectedly lighter. For the first time in years, the burden of her family's fractures did not weigh so heavily on her shoulders. She moved through the house with a renewed grace, her cane tapping softly on the hardwood floors as she visited each corner of the estate that held memories of a time when things had been simpler. One morning, she sat in the garden, wrapped in a thick shawl, the frost melting under the pale winter sun. Claire brought her tea and a stack of envelopes, each addressed in Eleanor's elegant handwriting. "These are ready," Eleanor said, handing them to Claire. "Make sure they're delivered when the time is right." Claire hesitated, her fingers brushing over the smooth paper. "Are you sure they'll understand?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "They may not understand immediately, but they will, in time." Meanwhile, the siblings began to navigate their new dynamic. Sarah, ever the planner, took it upon herself to organize the details of Eleanor's affairs, though this time she made an effort to involve her siblings. She called a meeting in the study, laying out documents and notes in neat stacks on the desk. "We need to review these together," Sarah said, her tone softer than usual. "Mum wants us all to be on the same page." Daniel raised an eyebrow but refrained from his usual sarcasm. "You're asking for our input," Sarah sighed, glancing at Emma, who had taken a seat near the window. "Yes. This isn't something I can or should do alone." Emma smiled faintly, her hands resting on her sketchbook. "It's a start." The three of them worked together in a way that felt tentative but genuine. Daniel, though not well versed in legalities, offered insights about the practical aspects of the estate. Emma, with her artist's eye, contributed ideas for how to preserve the character of the house and grounds. And Sarah, for once, listened without asserting control. Richard found himself acting as a bridge between generations, his quiet wisdom a balm to his bickering family. He spent much of his time with Eleanor, their conversations meandering through memories and plans for the future. One afternoon, he found her in the library, flipping through an old journal. "Grandma," he said, sitting beside her, "do you really think they can do it? Fix things?" Eleanor closed the journal, her fingers tracing its worn cover. "They already are. It's not perfect and it never will be, but they're trying. That's more than I dared hope for." Richard smiled. "You've done more for this family than anyone could have. I just hope they see that." Eleanor reached over, placing a hand on his. "They will, Richard. And when they do, it will be because of you." As the days passed, the family found themselves gravitating toward one another in small but meaningful ways. Emma invited Sarah to join her in the garden one morning, offering her a sketch pad and some charcoals. "I thought it might help to take a break," Emma said, her voice tentative. Sarah hesitated, but the sight of Emma's earnest expression softened her. She took the sketch pad and sat beside her sister, their quiet companionship a balm neither had realized they needed. In the evenings, Daniel joined Richard in the sitting room, where they pored over photo albums and shared stories of Eleanor's younger years. The laughter that echoed through the halls was a stark contrast to the arguments that had once dominated the house. Eleanor observed these changes with quiet satisfaction, though she remained cautious. She knew how fragile reconciliation could be, how easily old wounds could reopen. But for now, she allowed herself to bask in the small victories, the flickers of unity that hinted at a brighter future. One evening, as the family gathered around the dining table for the first shared meal in years, Eleanor raised her glass. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of her emotions. "To family," she said simply. The others raised their glasses, their expressions a mixture of gratitude and determination. For the first time, they were not just individuals bound by blood, they were a family striving to be whole. As the evening stretched on, Eleanor excused herself, retreating to her study with Claire's help. Once there, she opened the blue notebook and added a final entry, her pen moving with deliberate strokes. "When all seemed lost, I chose to believe. And in that belief, I found a family worth fighting for." She closed the notebook, a contented smile playing on her lips. For the first time in years, Eleanor Hathaway felt at peace. The Hathaway estate settled into a quiet rhythm that hadn't been felt in years. Days unfolded with a new harmony, tentative but sincere, as the family slowly adjusted to the fragile peace they had begun to build. The scars of past conflicts lingered, visible in stolen glances and occasional hesitations, but beneath those scars was a shared resolve to move forward. Eleanor observed these changes with a quiet satisfaction. Each morning, she took to the garden with Claire's assistance, sitting beneath the sprawling oak tree that had stood on the property for generations. It was here that she had shared moments of joy and sorrow with her late husband, where she had watched her children play as they grew, and where she now reflected on the legacy she hoped to leave behind. One crisp afternoon, Sarah joined her in the garden. She approached hesitantly, holding a steaming mug of tea in one hand and a thick book in the other. Eleanor looked up, her eyes softening at the sight of her eldest daughter. "May I sit with you?" Sarah asked. Eleanor gestured to the seat beside her. "Of course." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the faint rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds filling the air. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "Mother, I wanted to thank you," she began, "for everything, for not giving up on us, even when we gave you every reason to." Eleanor smiled faintly, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "A mother's love is a stubborn thing, Sarah. It refuses to yield, even in the face of disappointment." Sarah nodded, her throat tightening. "I've made so many mistakes, but I want you to know that I'm trying to be better." Eleanor reached over, placing a hand on Sarah's. "I see that," and I'm proud of you." Inside the house, Daniel and Emma worked together in the sitting room, sorting through old family photographs that had been tucked away for years. The air between them was lighter than it had been in decades, the sharp edges of their sibling rivalry dulled by time and reflection. "Look at this one," Emma said, holding up a photo of a young Daniel standing triumphantly beside a snowman that was nearly twice his size. "You were so proud of that thing. I remember you wouldn't let anyone else touch it," Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "And then it melted 2 days later, and I cried like it was the end of the world." Emma laughed, her eyes sparkling with the warmth of shared memories. "You were always so dramatic." "Still am," Daniel admitted with a grin. He glanced at Emma, his expression softening. "Thanks for doing this with me. It's been nice." Emma nodded, her smile fading slightly. "It has. I just wish we'd done it sooner." "Well," Daniel said, his tone uncharacteristically serious, "better late than never." Richard, ever the observer, watched these moments of connection unfold with a quiet pride. He had always been the family's anchor, the one who saw potential for reconciliation even when the others couldn't. Now, as he stood in the doorway of the sitting room, watching his aunts and uncles laugh over old memories, he felt a glimmer of hope for the future. Later that evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Eleanor surprised them by joining the table. It was a rare occurrence in recent years, her health often keeping her confined to her study or bedroom. But tonight, she seemed energized, her presence filling the room with warmth. The meal was simple but hearty, the conversation flowing with an ease that had once seemed impossible. Richard shared a story about his university days, eliciting laughter from Daniel and Sarah. Emma spoke about her plans to create a series of paintings inspired by the estate, her excitement contagious. Even Margaret, who had kept a lower profile in recent weeks, joined in, her usual sharpness tempered by a newfound humility. As the meal drew to a close, Eleanor raised her glass, her voice steady and clear despite her frailty. "To this family," she said, "may we continue to grow, to forgive, and to cherish the time we have together." The others echoed her toast, their voices blending in a chorus of shared commitment. For the first time in years, the Hathaway family felt like a family again. Not perfect, not free from flaws, but bound by something stronger than their differences. That night, as the house grew quiet, Eleanor sat in her study, her blue notebook open on the desk before her. She added a final note to the page she had started weeks ago, her pen moving with deliberate strokes. "Reconciliation is not a single moment, but a series of choices, each one a step toward healing. I see now that love, though often tested, is the most enduring legacy of all." She closed the notebook, her heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor allowed herself to rest, knowing that the family she had fought so hard to save was beginning to find its way. The Hathaway estate, once fraught with silence and discord, now hummed with a quiet vitality. The days passed in a slow, deliberate rhythm, each member of the family finding their place in this new era of cautious peace. The old wounds, though not entirely healed, had begun to scar over, their pain dulled by the steady salve of understanding and shared effort. It was during one of Eleanor's quieter afternoons that she stumbled upon a discovery that would deepen her perspective on the family she had fought so fiercely to save. She had taken to exploring the less frequented corners of the house, wandering through rooms that had long been sealed from daily use. It was in the attic, beneath a dusty sheet, that she found an old wooden chest. The chest was unassuming, its brass lock tarnished with age. But Eleanor's breath caught as she knelt before it. She recognized it immediately. It had belonged to her late husband, Arthur. Her hands, though no longer as steady as they once were, worked the lock free with a quiet determination. As the lid creaked open, A faint scent of cedar and thyme wafted out. Inside, nestled among yellowed papers and faded photographs, was a journal. Eleanor lifted it carefully, her fingers brushing over the leather cover. She had never known Arthur to keep a journal, and the thought of glimpsing his private reflections both excited and unsettled her. Settling into a nearby chair, she opened the journal, the brittle pages crackling softly as she turned them. Arthur's handwriting greeted her, a familiar scrawl that brought a lump to her throat. The entries were dated decades earlier, chronicling a time when their children were young and their lives had seemed full of endless potential. Eleanor read in silence, her heart tightening as she absorbed Arthur's words. He wrote of his hopes and fears for the family, his quiet struggles to balance his role as a father and husband with the demands of the estate. But it was his reflections on their children that struck Eleanor most deeply. "Sarah," one entry began, "has her mother's brilliance and her father's stubbornness. I see in her a fierce determination that will serve her well, though I fear it may also isolate her. I pray she learns the value of softness before it is too late." Another entry spoke of Daniel. "Our son has a heart that yearns for greatness, but he is blinded by his own ambition. He longs for my approval, though I suspect he does not know it. How can I show him that he is enough as he is?" And finally, there was Emma, our youngest, our dreamer. She moves through life with a lightness that I envy, though I worry it will leave her unmoored. She is our wildflower, beautiful and untamed, but fragile in the face of storms. Eleanor's vision blurred as she read on, her husband's words a mirror to her own fears and hopes. He had seen the same cracks in their family that she had, even then. Yet his love for them all was unmistakable, woven into every line. Near the back of the journal, an entry caught her attention. It was dated just a few months before Arthur's passing. "I wonder if Eleanor sees it," he had written. "The burden she carries is heavier than any one person should bear. She loves this family fiercely, but I fear she does not see how much they love her in return. I hope, in time, she will." Eleanor closed the journal, her hands trembling as she clutched it to her chest. Arthur's words were a revelation, a reminder of the quiet strength they had shared and the enduring legacy of love they had built together. That evening, Eleanor gathered her family in the study. She held the journal in her lap as they took their seats, their expressions curious but expectant. "I found something today," Eleanor began, her voice steady despite the emotions swelling within her. "Something that belongs to all of us." She opened the journal, reading aloud passages that spoke to each of them. Sarah listened intently, her eyes glistening as she heard her father's hopes for her. Daniel shifted in his seat, his usual bravado replaced by a quiet introspection. Emma smiled faintly, her hand resting over her heart. When Eleanor finished, she looked up, her gaze sweeping over her children and Richard. "Your father saw each of you for who you were, not just for your strengths, but for your struggles. He loved you, not in spite of your flaws, but because of them." The room was silent, the weight of Arthur's words settling over them like a gentle snowfall. Sarah reached for the journal, her fingers brushing over the worn cover. "I wish I could have heard this from him," she said softly. "You're hearing it now," Eleanor replied, "and perhaps that's enough." Emma leaned forward, her voice trembling. "Mom, do you think Dad would be proud of us, of how far we've come?" Eleanor's smile was soft, but certain. "I think he would be proud of the effort you're making. And I think he would remind you that love is not about perfection, it's about persistence." As the family lingered in the study, passing the journal among themselves, the walls of the estate seemed to exhale a long-held breath. The weight of the past had not vanished, but it had been reframed, its pain softened by the recognition of enduring love. For Eleanor, The discovery of Arthur's journal was more than a gift. It was a bridge, connecting the fractured present to the hopeful future she had fought to create. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that her family might truly find their way. The morning of Eleanor Hathaway's 84th birthday dawned crisp and golden, the first rays of sunlight streaming through the grand windows of the estate. A fresh snowfall blanketed the grounds, muffling the usual sounds of the countryside and creating a sense of stillness that felt almost reverent. Inside the house, a quiet flurry of activity unfolded as the family prepared for a celebration that felt more meaningful than any in recent years. It was Richard who had suggested a gathering to honor Eleanor, his voice steady and persuasive as he reminded his family of the strides they had made together. "We owe this to her," he had said, "not just because she's our mother or grandmother, but because she's the reason we've found our way back to each other." Eleanor sat in her study that morning, her shawl draped loosely over her shoulders. She had risen earlier than usual, her mind restless with thoughts of the day ahead. A faint knock at the door pulled her from her reverie, and she smiled as Claire entered with a tray of tea and toast. "Happy birthday, Mrs. Hathaway," Claire said warmly, setting the tray down on the small table beside her chair. Eleanor chuckled softly. "Another year older, and perhaps a little wiser." Claire smiled. "You've earned every bit of it." As she sipped her tea, Eleanor allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The events of the past months played through her mind like a series of vignettes, painful confrontations, tentative reconciliations, and moments of profound clarity. And through it all, she had held to the hope that her family could heal, that they could find a way to move forward together. Today, she realized, felt like a culmination of that hope. Downstairs, the dining room had been transformed into a space of understated elegance. Emma had taken charge of the decorations, her artistic touch evident in the delicate arrangements of flowers and candles that adorned the table. Sarah, ever practical, had ensured the menu was impeccable, while Daniel, to everyone's surprise, had volunteered to handle the music. As the family gathered in the room, their laughter and conversation filled the space with a warmth that had been absent for far too long. When Eleanor entered, leaning lightly on her cane, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to her, their expressions a mixture of admiration and affection. "Happy birthday, Mom," Sarah said, stepping forward to embrace her. Eleanor smiled, her gaze sweeping over her children and grandchildren. "Thank you. It's a joy to have you all here." Richard, standing near the head of the table, raised a glass. "To Grandma," he said, his voice steady and clear. "For her strength, her wisdom, and her love, things that have brought us all back to where we belong." The toast was met with a chorus of agreement, the clinking of glasses filling the room. Eleanor's heart swelled as she watched her family, the unity among them no longer fragile but genuine. As the meal unfolded, the atmosphere was one of celebration and reflection. Stories were shared, laughter came easily, and the barriers that had once divided them felt like distant memories. Even Margaret, whose sharp edges had softened in recent weeks, contributed to the lively conversation. Toward the end of the meal, Richard stood once more, a wrapped package in his hands. "We have something for you, Grandma," he said, his smile broad but tinged with emotion. "From all of us." He handed her the package, and Eleanor unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a painting, a stunning portrait of the estate, its grandeur captured with remarkable detail and warmth. But it was more than a simple depiction of the house. It was imbued with the spirit of the family, from the light in the windows to the faint silhouettes of figures in the garden. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "Who?" Emma smiled, her cheeks flushing slightly. "It was my idea, but we all contributed. It's a symbol of everything we've been through and everything we still have." Eleanor's eyes glistened with tears as she gazed at the painting. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than you could ever know." That evening, as the celebration wound down and the family lingered in the sitting room, Eleanor found herself alone for a moment. She sat by the fire, the painting resting on a nearby table, her thoughts turning to Arthur and the journal she had found in the attic. "I think you'd be proud of them," she murmured softly, her words meant for the man she had loved and missed for so many years. "Of us." As if in answer, a sense of peace washed over her, the warmth of the fire mirroring the contentment in her heart. The house that had once felt so heavy with discord now felt alive, its walls resonating with laughter and love. When Richard joined her a moment later, he sat in silence for a while before speaking. "Grandma, do you think we'll be okay? All of us?" Eleanor turned to him, her smile serene. "I think you already are." As the fire crackled and the evening deepened, Eleanor Hathaway felt a quiet triumph settle within her. She had fought for her family, and they had found their way. Her legacy, she realized, was not in the wealth she had built or the estate she had maintained, but in the love that would endure long after she was gone. And in that, she found her greatest joy. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.